Okay, good afternoon, everyone from I'm in Washington, D.C. My name is Suzanne Lachelier, and forgive me, this is my first time hosting. I've been to many, many dialogues because I'm Paul Lachelier's sister. Welcome to this Family Diplomacy Dialogue on Climate Change. I'm an attorney in Washington, D.C. I work in criminal defense and human rights, just to give you a little background about me. And I defend a death penalty defendant who is charged in Guantanamo military commissions. So that's my background, which actually surprisingly, the Guantanamo work has touched on climate change because I've represented people from areas of the world very much affected, like Sudan, by climate change. These dialogues are part of the Family Diplomacy Initiative, or FDI, of Learning Life. And FDI's purpose is to connect people worldwide across lines of country, class, race, and religion via the internet to share and learn together about families and citizen diplomacy, with an eye to developing a core of trained family diplomats and family diplomacy ambassadors to advocate for a more caring world. And they use media, businesses, nonprofits, and governments. So the idea is to train them to have that eye in the work that they do wherever it may be around the world. You can learn more, and Asmi is helping here to post. You can learn more about FDI looking in the chat. Asmi is going to post the link for FDI. Today's dialogue agenda, thank you, Asmi. We're introducing the speaker. No, Paul doesn't like to say speakers because he wants it to be a dialogue. So, but you are the speakers, and the experts are going to introduce themselves so that all the participants, have some sense of their expertise and the kinds of input they can give you as you talk about how climate change has affected you. We have a really impressive number of speakers today with amazing spot-on background. So I'm really excited to have everybody talk. So there'll be 5 minutes of my introductions, my talking right now, and then 10 minutes of introductions from the experts, and then a dialogue for about 30 minutes with everybody who's here, and then an open discussion with the remaining time. And the dialogue is intended to be from you, the families, and the participants who are joining, with the experts giving input as they hear the comments. Please use the hand up icon from Zoom so that we can know to call on you. And if you speak another language, you can activate the captions in Zoom at the bottom of your screen so that you get the translation. For everyone who's here, we'd ask that you introduce yourself in the Zoom chat. If you want to share your email, feel free. You're not obligated to, of course, or your Facebook profile or your LinkedIn. When you introduce yourself, please give your name, the city, country that you're calling in from. And then Asmi is also going to post 5 ways that you can connect and learn and help spread family diplomacy. First, there's a FDI Facebook group. There's an FDI YouTube channel on which this dialogue will be posted afterwards. So we are recording, just on notice for everyone. You can sign up for the FDI Dispatch, which is the newsletter for family diplomacy. And then, of course, you can serve as a family diplomacy diplomat or ambassador. And that's it. I think we can get started. Okay, and I mean that we started, but really getting started is getting all the speakers to talk and introduce themselves. We have Ritika Subramanian, who has a PhD and a Master's of Philosophy from Cambridge in multidisciplinary gender studies. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I tried to take good notes. But she also has an interesting background because she served as a journalist before going on to get her PhD. And I'm briefly doing introductions. I'll let you each amplify a little more just to save time. And we have Sabrina Fiallo, who is a PhD candidate in climate change and sustainable development policy, specifically focusing on children and democracy and the intersection of climate change. She is at the University of Lisbon, and she also has a background preceding her PhD work, which I suppose is common. And she worked in both the private and public sector at the EU and the UN and Google Cloud, among others. Again, I'm summarizing, so forgive me. And then James McCowan, who joins from Boston. He has a PhD in clinical psychology. He is associate professor at Harvard and works at the Mass General Hospital. His PhD is from BU, I have to mention, because I went to BU Law School, so Boston University. So I just have to mention alma mater. And he focuses on climate change and climate change psychology and addiction, which is really interesting intersection. So I'll ask each of you, Ratika, if you want, in the order in which I introduce you, to go ahead and give a quick summary of your background so people kind of know what you can provide input on. Thank you.
Sure,
Ratika.
Suzanne. Thank you so much. And hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. So, as Suzanne already introduced me, my name is Ritika, and I'm joining from the UK. In terms of my work broadly, I mean, I began as a journalist, as she said, and I was reporting on issues around migration, climate change, gender. And over a period of time with my PhD and the work that I do now, I largely focus on questions around climate adaptation, gender relations, and specifically focusing on child marriage. And I do run a podcast called Climate Brides, which drew on my doctoral research and my current postdoctoral work, where I try and understand how climate is deepening existing drivers of child marriage, specifically in South Asia. And those are the questions I'm exploring through my research, and I'm very much looking forward to contributing to questions around gender adaptation, development, and from that political economy perspective. Thank you.
Sabrina, you want to go ahead?
Hi, everyone. Really pleased to be here and meet all of you and discuss such an important question as climate change and how you are living it, experiencing it. I'm currently doing a PhD in climate change and sustainable development policies. It's been going on for close to 4 years now, and I'm still doing a lot of research. In my field work, I have been working with hundreds of children from different parts of Portugal. And I'm very interested in stimulating children's political agency when it comes to climate governance. So really, how can we get children and adults living around them participating, contributing to climate governance? That's me. Thank you.
James.
Hey everyone, really pleased to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I'm British, so Ritika, I'm going home next month, so I'll be able to get all my British stuff now that I live in America. I can't get all my teas and biscuits and all those things that I like and miss. So, James McCann, I'm a clinical child psychologist. My climate journey has been kind of all over the place. I was actually marine biology undergrad and then kind of pivoted to do mental health work through some family impacts of addiction on my brother, and so decided to sort of pivot and do clinical psychology focusing on addiction. And so only in about 2019 did I kind of pivot to do more climate work specifically, just thinking like, what can I do and how can I bring together psychology and clinical psychology and climate change, because I work with kids and youth, and that was coming up into the clinical space. So I'm a climate aware trained therapist, so I do some one-on-one counseling. I also run groups for teens. I've got a group coming up in August for a week where we do some climate resilience emotion work with a bunch of kids from all over the US. And outside of clinical stuff, I do some clinical research in climate change. So I just finished serving 20,000 6th through 12th graders. So in the US, that's like 12, 13 through 18 about climate change, trying to identify who are the teens at risk for climate distress, and more importantly, impairing climate distress. So it gets in the way of their functioning, as well as other characteristics of certain kids that are more vulnerable to more significant climate distress, where it gets in their way in coping. And submitting two grants. One is to study heat resiliency in super vulnerable patients at the hospital, so mostly in the addiction space where they're unhoused or minoritized urban heat island kind of population, to try and figure out how to reduce overdose risk, which is exacerbated in heat. And then just submit a super cool grant. I don't think we'll get it, but you never know, to use VR XR technologies to engage youth in sort of world building, nature world building, and climate resiliency strategies. So yeah, that's kind of my stuff in a nutshell.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all, to all of you. So we have a number of people joining us at this point. I saw a lot of people popping in as we were introducing ourselves. So I would ask people to just join in with if people have comments and want to discuss something about climate change that have particularly affected them or their families, or something they've observed in their corner of the world about climate change. Please, step in, raise your hand and talk. Because we want to hear from you first and foremost about your personal experience with climate change. Presumably you joined today because you have things to say. We will start to off the conversation with and I'm going to get it wrong. Yukta, I'm sorry if I said your name wrong. Yukta is going to do a brief presentation so that it'll hopefully get, in addition to the speakers' backgrounds, which are very thought-provoking for me, Yukta is going to talk generally about climate change. Is Yukta here? I do not see you.
I'm right here. And
Okay, sorry, I lost you because I'm trying to follow on the screen. If you could go ahead and I guess you want to screen share and do your presentation. Thank you.
Before I go ahead and start that, though, I just want to remind everyone that's in attendance here today to please drop your little blurb in the chat just for our records. Name, email, or LinkedIn if you're willing to, and whatever background you're coming from would be really awesome. Thank you all for being here today. I'm go ahead and share my screen. All right. Is everyone able to see everything?
Yes.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Yukta, and I'm currently interning here at Learning Life. Today, I'm going to be talking about climate change, specifically what the latest data tells us and how its effects are showing up in the lives of families around the world. I want to start by saying that I know climate change can feel like a big, overwhelming topic, but I've been doing a lot of research on this lately, and what struck me most isn't that science itself, it's how concrete and immediate the human impact already is. So that's really what I want to focus on here today. Let's start with where we are. 2024 was the hottest year ever recorded in human history. The World Meteorological Organization confirmed that global temperatures are about 1.55 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Now, that number can be hard to contextualize, so think of it this way. Scientists describe the 1.5 degree threshold as a point beyond which climate impacts shift from serious to increasingly irreversible. We crossed it in 2024, at least temporarily. And the UN Environmental Programme's latest data shows us that even under current national commitments, we're on track for somewhere between 2.3 and 2.5 degrees of warming by the end of the century. To stay within 1.5 degrees, global emissions would need to fall 55% by 2035. Right now, they're still rising. So what does that mean in practice? And what does warming actually do to families? The most visible consequence is displacement. According to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center's 2025 report, 83.4 million people were living in internal displacement, meaning they were forced to leave their homes due to conflict, violence, human rights violations, or natural hazards, but still remain within their home countries at the end of 2024. That number has more than doubled in 6 years, and in 2024 alone, 45.8 million new disaster displacements were recorded, the highest annual figure since tracking began, nearly double the decade's average. Of those, 99.5% were caused by weather-related events. Cyclones, floods, wildfires, events that climate science tells us are becoming more frequent and more intense. The next area I want to highlight is the impact on children's health and food security, because I think this is where the stakes become most clear. Sorry, guys, I'm a little bit under the weather at the moment. Please forgive me. UNICEF reports that 88% of the additional disease burden caused by climate change falls on children under the age of 5. As temperatures rise and rainfall patterns shift, diseases like malaria, dengue, and cholera are spreading into regions with no prior exposure and limited medical infrastructure to respond. At the same time, droughts and glacier melt are disrupting food systems at a global scale. When harvests fail, food prices rise, and for families already operating without a financial cushion, that gap is impossible to absorb. UNICEF estimates that 55 million children in Latin America and the Caribbean alone face water scarcity as a direct result of climate change, with real consequences for health, education, and daily family life. What I keep coming back to in all of this research is an equity question. The communities experiencing the most severe climate impacts are, by and large, the ones that contributed the least to causing them. That pattern holds at the global level and within countries. It's something I think is important to name because it shapes how we think about who bears responsibility for solutions. So let's talk about solutions because I don't think it's fair to just leave it there. The encouraging thing, and there are general and their general well, and there genuinely is encouraging news, is that clean energy is scaling faster than most projections anticipated. Renewable energy accounted for a third of global electricity generation in 2024. Solar capacity grew 15% in a single year. The technology exists and it's becoming cheaper. The challenge now is speed and political commitment. On the policy side, 2025 was a deadline year for countries to submit updated national climate plans under the Paris Agreement. Scientists and the UN are clear that those plans need to be significantly more ambitious than what's currently on the table. Beyond national policy, investment in community level adaptation, early warning systems, food infrastructure, heat response plans has been shown to directly reduce human cost of climate disasters. And at the community level, which I think is especially relevant for the families in this room, disaster preparedness and neighbor to network connectivity consistently show up in the research as among the most effective buffers against climate impacts. Knowing your neighbors, having a plan, knowing who in your community needs help when something happens, that stuff really matters. Thank you for listening. Let's go ahead and jump into the rest of the dialogue.
Thank you, Yuka. That's very helpful starting point for the dialogue. I saw Eloise Dagneau joined. Eloise, would you like to take 4 to 5 minutes to talk about your research? Eloise is joining us from, I think, from what Paul told me, Bangladesh. I don't know how good her connection is, where she is in Bangladesh. Okay, it looks like it's pretty good. Eloise, do you want to go ahead and present your research?
Hi everyone. Sorry, I got a reboost of my computer when I was logging in. I was in Bangladesh and just came back to Belgium now. But yes, nice to meet you all. I am a researcher and project manager at Leuven University, which is a city here in Belgium. And for the past months, I've been in Bangladesh, based in Dhaka, but we were doing field trips and comparative studies in the north and the south, where we studied with a local NGO called Friendship, the impacts of floodings and cyclones for the south and flash floods and extreme heat and cold in the north. So those impacts on health.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll hope we can contribute as people make comments from what you learned too. So we're going to open it up to everyone. Please raise your hand if you have comments or thoughts on how climate change has affected you, where you are in your part of the world, or what you've observed too. It doesn't have to have directly affected you, although I think it's directly affecting pretty much all of us at this point with the temperature changes. But yeah, we'd like to hear. I know, for example, in Northern Europe, they're having a major heat wave right now. With an eye to talking just about where just your observations. It doesn't have to be, research specific or anything like that. That's why we have the experts here, sort of give some more context to anything you've observed. One question, if we don't have any hands raised yet, is that I had. Oh, sorry, I don't want to jump in ahead. It looks like David, but you introduced yourself as Tice on the computer, I noticed. So Tice, go ahead and joining us from Virginia, I believe. Oh, okay. Oh, you're muted. I recognize you now. Okay. You're muted.
There we go.
There
Okay.
you go. Okay.
Yes. Sorry, I'm on my husband's account. Yeah, like you said, speaking of Northern Europe, I moved from Germany, and there was a big difference, say 6 years ago, in the temperatures. Germany, most houses don't have air conditioning because it wasn't necessary. Toward the end of the 6 years, it was so uncomfortable because the houses are made of concrete. So they're looking at some of the newer homes, trying to now add AC or figure that out. But you can't retrofit homes that are 1,000 years old. So I just kind of was thinking about that. But I wanted to mention my son, who was a former intern. He's an FDA, but he's not here today. Adrian Mata. So he just came back from El Salvador and Guatemala, where he was visiting family. And he had the opportunity to go to some land that his his family, father or grandfather owns, and they were local coffee farmers. And I was really stunned at the pictures that he brought back because I was on that property about 20 years ago. It was much greener. It was lush. There were very tall, big trees. And now the trees are much smaller, so they don't have the shade trees, which are very important for farming, coffee farming. There's been less rain, very high temperatures, which you can't have. And then there's some other forces that come into play in El Salvador, such as big families who come in and then take advantage of the vulnerable local families. So it was just very kind of upsetting to me to kind of see that difference. And a lot of it is because of climate change. So they just cannot reap the same harvest that they've always had. I know that his grandfather would also open up the farm to the local villagers to come and take as much fruit as they'd like, as long as it did not disturb the tree, because that tree was needed to grow the coffee. So that has now affected the local villagers as well, because there's not as much food to offer to them. So they've definitely been seeing the effects of it, and a lot of small farmers have actually lost their farms because the land and then deforestation is actually a big problem as well, which then contributes to a lot of the issues you have with climate change. So just wanted to share that.
Yeah, thanks, Thais. Ritika, I mean, both Ritika and Sabrina, I think that you may have comments on that. It particularly strikes me and also Yuka's presentation touched on the social inequities of climate change and who it's affecting. And I wonder if you just had some thoughts on that. I know that's a really huge topic, but if what Thais said provoked any thoughts about your work or your experience with climate change.
So, should I go first, Sabrina?
Yes. Oh, sure. Go
Okay.
ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, Suzanne, thanks. Yeah, I think these are really pertinent points, and it really got me thinking around, like, listening to all the presentations so far in terms of what climate change really means on the ground. In terms of how its experiences are very much linked to existing social institutions or existing, questions around livelihood, questions around decisions to move, what kind of, employment, or even like I look at marriage, for instance, how does marriage function within these, changing systems? So the way you spoke about cropping patterns changing is very much linked to a lot of questions around who, owns capital, for instance, or, what kind of labor arrangements exist over there. And these are broader questions that I was thinking of. So for instance, even in the work that I do, say I run this podcast called Climate Brides, the first question we ask people is, what is climate change to you? And there's no real definite answer. For instance, it's very much linked to, okay, there's been a change in like the cropping season patterns, for instance, days are getting hotter, or, over a period of time. So yeah, basically, I think grounding it very much, like whatever experiences we're talking about now, very much grounded in life histories and life decisions, I think is very, very pertinent. And that's coming across in this conversation so far.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, Ritika, putting in the chat your podcast link if you have it handy, I think it might be interesting. We have a lot of students, and I think it would be educational for them. Thank you. Sabrina, do you have any thoughts based on your research, and especially with children? I imagine that you have a lot of comments on the impact on poor children or children of certain families. Yeah, go ahead.
Absolutely. I actually wanted to share with you something a bit more personal, but what motivated me to study climate change and sustainability was my own experience as a child. As a child, I was a nature lover, so I was spending a lot of time outside in the north of France where I grew up. And back then in the 80s, so I'm not that young anymore, in the 80s, we had really rough winters and there was a lot of snow. We had many, many days of snow. And I loved that because me and my sister could play a lot. We knew that at some point in December, January or February, we would have playful days playing in the snow. And as I kept growing up, I realized that winters were warmer and warmer. And then at some point, we even spent one entire winter without snow. The snow was melting instantly as it hit the ground. And I remember as a child that it actually left me confused as to why this was happening, and back then we were not talking so much about climate change. This was not part of school curriculums, so we were not so aware of what was going on. And so it took me some years to make a connection between my own experience as a child and what was actually happening. And I'm pretty sure that there are many children who are experiencing the same. And the feeling, and from that perspective, James will be probably more inclined to comment on that. But the feeling is a loss. You feel that you've lost something that was part of your reality, of your life, of your experiences, and suddenly it changed, and you don't recognize the place where you grew up, the place where you belong to, the images, the memory. And there's a disconnect between what you see and what's happening. What you used to see and what is happening. But I wanted to add something else as well. It's not so much about the experience, but more about the introduction that was done by, I'm sorry,
Yuka.
Yuka. I was
Yeah.
looking at the name. There are a couple of solutions that families can do very, very easily, and sometimes these are overlooked. We tend to think about energy. When we think about climate change, we immediately think about fossil fuels and energy. But actually, the way we treat food is also very, very important. There are some greenhouse gases that are coming directly from methane, about 1/4. So families, for example, can manage food waste. If you could reduce your food waste, you're doing something tremendously important to contribute to the solution. And the second thing is also reducing meat consumption.
Thank you for that. As a vegan, I thank you for saying that. I probably should have introduced myself as a vegan at the outset, but I don't like being too militant. Arthur's had his Arthur. I don't know if you go by Art or Arthur, but your hand's been up for a little bit. James, I'll come back to you because we have touched on things that I want to ask you about, but I wanted to let Arthur say or Art say what he wants to discuss.
Yeah. I wanted to add my own personal experiences, if that's okay.
Of course, that's what we're here for.
Yeah, so I want to add on to what other people have said about the rising temperatures, especially in Europe, in that like I've also had experiences of when I was a kid, when I went to my grandma's house in France in winter, there was snow and we'd go sledding in the backyard. And that's basically unthinkable now. And also I saw the forecast for Europe in the coming week, and I'm horrified because it's like 40 degrees Celsius, and you never see that before. Like it's unprecedented, and as was said before, like the houses are just completely not built for it because it was never needed beforehand.
Right.
And then
Yeah.
what?
Sorry, a quick question, if you don't mind telling us your age, because I think it's important to note in what time frame you've observed that change.
Yes, I'm 21, and I went. Well, I didn't go in my teen years because of school and such. But when I was a little kid, I went to France in winter, and it was snowing then. And I mean, from what I've heard, it's just not really the case anymore. And I think one of the things that struck me the most about my experiences traveling abroad is a couple years ago, I had the opportunity to go hiking in the Alps, and there are lots of glaciers there, and there are some glaciers that over a hundred years ago filled up the entire valley was full of ice, and now it's all gone. Almost all of it is gone, and that was like actually really shocking and sad for me. And I was like, I'm still sad about it. And it's like that is the most direct evidence I could think of climate change, that the ice was there and it melted because and I'm honestly kind of scared next time I'm gonna go there. It's gonna be even more gone because Europe has had such record heat waves these last few years.
Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate it. And Yukta, I keep missaying your name, so I'm trying to get it right. Go ahead with your comments, please. Thank you for that, Art.
You actually pronounced it perfectly that time, so you're all
Okay.
good. Don't
Thanks.
worry.
I'm getting better.
Thank you so much, Arthur, for sharing. Yeah, I wanted to go back to how climate change can oftentimes disproportionately affect marginalized communities and groups. And my family lives in Michigan. That's where I was born and raised. And right now, there are a lot of data center development projects in and around my hometown. And we look back at all of these other data center development projects and their lasting consequences on the water supply, on the weather around those regions. And we also see that these data centers are often in places that are suffering from more poverty or inequities compared to I'm going to speak from a US perspective. I can't really speak on the rest of the world, especially considering data centers. Um, but we see that communities that are already marginalized already have are already in food deserts, already have a lack of access to water, often get further debilitated by these data center construction projects. And it's like this has been a lasting theme, even before the rapid data center development that we're seeing today. Just last night, because I'm in DC right now, I went to the Natural History Museum's exhibit on climate change, just in preparation to do some research for my presentation today. And I saw a really captivating exhibit about how hurricane disasters, specifically Katrina, negatively impacted marginalized communities and groups on the outer parts of New Orleans, more so than it did on wealthy communities within New Orleans. And this has been a lasting theme that we've seen all throughout history. So people on the outside are often being hurt a lot more by the consequences of the whole's actions. And I just wanted to highlight that really quickly because we talk about the positive things that have happened since the past, but different negative things keep happening to undo that, and we keep suffering the consequences beyond that. I think it's always really important to prioritize every single person when we are thinking about climate change, when we're thinking about what can be done and what needs to be changed. But yeah, I just wanted to circle back to that, something I was thinking about.
I think that, yeah, and that's a lot of what not my personal experience, my observation experience. My personal experience is more akin to Art's, but because I grew up in Northern Europe and Sabrina, so I've seen that change. But I've seen in my work a lot of families affected, whether they know it or not, they're economically affected. And I think Ritika, right? Ritika was touching on that, is that a lot we talk about climate change and the environmental aspect, but ultimately there's an economic consequence, which is really what the families experience, right? That, of course, they experience the environmental, but ultimately that's the economic piece is what ends up being the most impactful, I think, and creating the disparities. And I think that's what we're all touching on. Please, Ritika, go ahead.
Yeah, I think great points. I mean, I think Yukta, I think you made a very strong point, and I think I just wanted to harp on that a little bit because I think the question of climate change, it is an issue of justice. I mean, we can't take away from the fact that it is at the end of the day a justice issue that we're talking about, and equity is at its heart and center. Is what I mean in terms of what should really inform our discussions and conversations broadly, because it is a gender issue. For instance, looking at the ways in which, say, labor is arranged. So when Yukta was talking about marginalized communities, even within that, who's accessing water, who's making sure there's food on the table, and all of these sort of translate into labor burdens as well. So in a way, it affects communities who are, doing at the end of, who are associated with the labor attached to bringing resources onto the table. So I think that those are questions we need to understand, and we can unpack that on questions around gender, race, caste, class, and all of, disability, for instance, are very much linked to the conversation I think we are having. Yeah.
What's I actually I want to go to James because we haven't heard from James, and we've touched on a lot of things his research affects, and then I don't think we have any other hands up anyhow, and then I'll come back because I do have a question for you, Ritika. James, you can probably just let you talk because I'm sure people have brought up a lot of things, but that you have comments about. But in particular, hearing Arthur talk, and I'm always struck by when youth talk about it. It almost brings tears to my eyes, frankly, when I hear, because they're looking at such a longer stretch of time, right? In 21 years, he's observed a change, and he's still at this point statistically could live to be 80 something, 90 something, right? And so I wanted to more end with this, but you can at least start touching on the things, and Sabrina did, the things that should help them cope. And Sabrina did with an action item of, food waste reduction and reduction in meat consumption, but other things, not just action items, just coping skills or whatever it is that you want to comment on. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Just hearing a lot of stuff in the room, a lot of emotion, right? Because this is obviously a highly emotive issue, understandably. And I agree with that you can't talk about climate change really without calling it an environmental racism issue, given all the things that everybody knows and has talked about. Yeah, I think folks, particularly authors talking about the concept of solastalgia, which some of you may be familiar with, which is sort of a term around sort of eco-grief, eco-anxiety, but it's sort of homesick whilst at home, i.e. that there's been significant changes to your home environment that as a consequence of climate change that have led to kind of eco-distress. And so, yeah, for young people, obviously they're to your point, they're the most affected because climate change affects them for the longest period of their lifetime, right? Their life course. It's going to affect me less because I'm older than someone who's younger, but also as critically is that climate change impacts, whether it's displacement, hurricanes, food insecurity, has impacts on really critical stages of their development, particularly neurodevelopment, right? So if you have experienced displacement, that's highly stressful. That's going to, you have increased rates of PTSD. There's a lot of data that came out of Katrina following children over time and just the high rates of PTSD, but also learning disabilities as well as other challenges because they're out of school and affects their executive functioning. So there's lots of sort of direct ways that climate change impacts children and youth, through the experience of an extreme weather event, but also indirect ways. So droughts affecting micronutrients in food that increase risk of psychiatric illness and neurodevelopmental challenges. So there's just a lot of different ways it impacts us directly and indirectly. And many of you are probably familiar with some of the larger research projects that have been done looking at global youth by Hickman and Lewandowski and others that have shown just very high rates of climate distress and anxiety in teens. My data was great because I got to survey young children, which have often not been really assessed. And people think, well, how could young kids really be paying attention? But sixth graders, about 45% of them experience climate worry, and about 10% experience impairing climate worry. And that's just in 12-year-olds. So that's really concerning from they are aware, they have their eyes open, they hear what's going on, they see their environment changing even in these short periods of time. Maybe we can pause there and happy to talk about kind of coping beyond action. But I think
Yeah, I
yeah.
wanted to maybe not too Pollyanna-ish, but I wanted to sort of end with that from each of you in a few minutes, but a little bit later about sort of giving them tools. And I really appreciate Sabrina bringing up the food issue and the connection with that, because I think that is one of the things we can talk about as we end closer to the ending. But thank you. Yeah, that's recognizing what they face. Sabrina, do you have any? I don't think we have any hands up. I want to make sure I'm not missing anyone. But Sabrina, do you have any comments on what James just added to the conversation?
I absolutely agree with James that the fact that children are younger doesn't mean that they don't pay attention. On the contrary, they are completely aware of what's going on. And as a child, I was not bombarded by news about climate change in social media and TV channels all the time. And I was just by the very simple fact of observing around me changes from year after year. And this was causing some distress. And this is the reason why I decided to study this when I was a bit older and I had to make some choices at university. And so I can only imagine a fraction of the anxiety that some children may experience, because when you're getting so many different apocalyptic messages, and we have to be honest, it is obviously not an exaggeration, and we are not being dramatic about what's going on. It's what science is telling us. But it is very difficult to remain optimistic with such a difficult outlook. And in that case, then we need to provide children and families with the right mechanisms to cope, but with also with other ways of feeling that they can get engaged, that they can participate to the solution. This is what I'm trying to do with the children I work with, and it's very challenging. I have to be very sensitive to the different age the children I'm working with. I work with children who are 8, 9, but I also work with teenagers, and they are obviously very different. They have different needs. They also understand things sometimes in different ways. So I have to use I have to adapt my language. I have to adapt my methods, depending on the groups I'm working with. And I'm also working with some very international groups. So as Ritika was saying, we also have to be mindful of climate justice, of intersectionality. When we work with children and we are working, for example, I've been working with some children who have autism, and how, if they are unable to express their feelings, we have to find other ways of having them express these feelings. Perhaps they are not comfortable articulating it with verbally, but perhaps they can use artistic methods, for example, to express what they are feeling. And it's very hard for me to go to schools and explain to children, okay, so here is climate change, this is happening, this is what we can expect, the consequences are this and that, the solutions may, you can do this, you can do that. But I have to be very honest with them. And I remember the very first workshop I went through, and there's one boy who was 9, and he asked me, he looked very worried about what we had just been discussing. And he looked at me very seriously and he asked, so, are we going to be able to deal and overcome this climate change problem? And suddenly I was caught off guard, because I should have seen this question coming. I should have expected that at some point one child or many more child will ask this question, which is only fair and legitimate, that they ask, well, actually, okay, you've discussed all of this, but are we going to be able to sort this out? So my answer, and I only had a few seconds to think about, oh, okay, how am I going to answer this question? So I said, look, I hope we will. So I'm not saying yes, okay? I'm not saying no, but I'm saying that me as a person, I hope we will. And then a few seconds later, I said, well, at least partially, because there are things we cannot control, but there are things that we control and that we can act upon. So I spent the rest of my workshops talking about democracy and all the different mechanisms that are accessible to children, so that if they want, they can actually use. They may not be able to vote because they don't have the legal age for this, but there are plenty of other mechanisms that they can use, and that can help them also feel that they are not just sitting there witnessing what's happening as mere spectators, without the possibility of also doing something about it, especially if it's bothering them.
It's really helpful. Thank you. Thank you. That's moving to me. Thank you. James has not surprisingly, after what you just said, James has his hand up.
Yeah, I think just continuing the conversation about, environmental justice, the research shows that folks who are, minoritized, Black and brown folks, but also I want to raise as an LGBTQ plus person, as well as some of my research highlighting that gender minority youth and trans youth and LGBTQ youth broadly are also more distressed about climate change and are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, just because we think about climate as a sort of threat multiplier in that way that it exacerbates already existing structural inequalities, and in particular when it comes to health resiliency. And so just sort of highlighting that it impacts not just racial groups, but also gender and sexual minoritized populations inequally. So yeah, I think some of the kids I work with, bring up questions like that, Sabrina, to echo what you say. And I think it's important. I take a lot of my learnings from Rebecca Solnit. Some of you may be familiar with her. She's a great author and poet and writer in the climate space. She's written a number of books, but she does bring into the story the narrative of think about climate as other major humanitarian social shifts, right? And social dynamics that we have to take the long game. We can't take the world on our shoulders. We can't fix the entire planet. But, same question is, can we fix racism? Can we fix, homophobia? It's not just a single event that it's, built on the shoulders of others who came before us, but we are making strides. We have made change in climate. We've bent the temperature curve already. But not to be Pollyanna-ish, to your point, Sabrina, you can't just sort of make it all. We'll get there. Yes, we'll fix it. But this idea of the sort of the validation of the experience plus the connotation of hope, because without hope, we're really, we are definitely gonna stay stuck. But other social movements, voting rights in the United States, suffragette movement, all these other changes that happened gradually over time and took community and took continued work have really made some great strides. So I imagine that, this is also going to be true and is already true with climate change. Like meeting today is an example of being active, and an activism stance is talking about it, raising it, and finding others like you that can also continue to address the issue. So that's how I think about this problem.
Just one little personal side note. I recently finished a master's in an LLM. It's called a master's in animal law. And I came across, I found it very hopeful for me on the climate change side, because believe it or not, when you study animal law, you end up touching on climate change because it does affect animals, of course. But you also touch on farming animals, and to Sabrina's point about the impact of methane and industrial agriculture. So I found that community very helpful. And I'm mentioning it because I was introduced, embarrassingly perhaps, because I wasn't familiar with it before, to the concept of One Health. And I'm sure all of the experts here today have heard of it, but I wanted Eloise to discuss it briefly because she mentioned it in the chat, and I think for some of the younger in the group who haven't heard about it, it may be something to help you conceptualize an approach and to understand that this is actually a movement and a way of approaching policies at all levels, from what Ritika does to I think what James does to some degree, and Sabrina. It's an understanding of how to approach climate change, but yeah, let me leave it at that, and I'll let Eloise, if you're still there, Eloise, to discuss it a little more in depth. Thanks.
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay, perfect. So the One Health is an approach that also comes from the philosophy, very close to the planetary health perspective, where we recognize that humans are not just the only species on this earth. They also, and their health, their well-being is connected to the environment in which we live in and the animals with which we interact. So it's this triangle. But the planetary health is also this idea that we live on a planet all together, and so everything is an interactive system. And so if one goes in one direction, what are the collateral effects on all the other spheres? So it's really about, it's also seeing our world in a system. And yeah, if there's one impact somewhere, there's probably another somewhere else. And so anyway, so that's the basis of the thinking. And for example, in Bangladesh, one of the things we were looking at were the impacts of flooding and cyclones on the local char communities. Chars are moving islands of sand that people live on because it's free land, so you can go and cultivate there. And they're also super fertile because of all the nutrients coming from the ocean, but unfortunately also very prone to, well, extreme weather events, and they're increasing and they're more and more unpredictable. So that's a big danger, because then you find yourself with a population that wants to be there because it helps them financially to earn money through the crops and the animals that they have. But also, this is also dangerous for them in terms of security, of their income itself, but also their housing. And one of the things we were looking at was well, asking how are they healthy? And a big thing is that comes up is, oh, but if our animals are not healthy, we are not healthy. Not just because they depend on the animals for income, but also because they eat their animals, or yeah, um, the animals can also help in their daily life. So it's a resource as much as it's food. Um, and one thing they were saying is, yes, we know that we have to give fresh water to our our cattle, but it's not always possible because fresh water, clean water, sorry, is expensive and not always easily accessible. So yeah, and another point that also came up is we would love to be able to treat our animals a lot better. And so one of the interventions that Friendship, the NGO I was working with, was to train local animal health workers on the main current disease that occur. But on the long term, a big solution would be vaccines. However, vaccines are covered by some vaccines are covered by the Bangladeshi government for humans, but they're not for animals. It's super expensive for many of them. And so then you start wondering in terms of equality of species, um, but also that if you don't have vaccines for animals and then they're getting sick and you're eating sick animals, what does it mean for you? Um, yeah, so all these dynamics that came up, and I actually really liked what you said, James, with the short term and the long terms, because the um, short long term effects of climate change was that a story that came up was, okay, there's a cyclone, and then everything is disrupted, everything is falling apart, and families don't have food. All right, so a lot of NGOs come and they provide food, and you reconstruct, but then they leave. But the thing is, cyclones, they're salty water on a land that needs to grow food, well, that doesn't work. There's a delay. And this delay is something very interesting to study because you come and you have to clean first. First, you need rain to wash out the salt. Then you have to put new crops, but that takes time to grow. So for those at least 3 months, people are not earning a lot of money, are quite hungry. Children get out of school because they need to help at home. A lot of issues persist because you're still exposed to salty water on the long term. Uh, yeah, so and this is a long-term dynamic where short term you have short-term famine, long term, well, economic issues because you never go back to normal. So you always get a bit poorer and poorer every time there's a cyclone. And a long term is that salt bioaccumulates. So even though there's rainwater that washes it away, it's still going to stay. And so it stays, it stays, it stays. And now what we're seeing is banana trees, they don't grow as much. Paddy fields don't thrive as much. So what can you grow if what you've always lived on was rice and now you shouldn't grow rice? It's a big collaboration with veterinarians, agronomists, also a lot of engineers and architects. But yeah.
Thank you for that. That's actually really good sort of like zooming in look at the effect of climate change in a particular area and this One Health concept, which I came at it with the animal welfare aspect, but to learn that there is this, I hate to call it philosophy because I think it's not just a philosophy, it's being implemented. And I'm going to ask Ritika to maybe talk about it. And I don't know if Sabrina, your work has touched on it, this One Health concept, but this approach of recognizing the interconnection between animal health, human health, and environmental health, and the effects of industrial agriculture. And Ritika, I know you posted something about women's agriculture group, Western India, building new forms of farming models. I imagine it's micro farming, not not industrial ag. So I don't know if you can speak to that, actually the example that you just put in, and perhaps maybe educational for everyone to hear about.
Sure, thank you. So yeah, I think it sort of connects very much to the points that are being discussed right now. In this particular example, I mean, it was a comic book that we developed along with women farmers in Western India, which is a historically drought-prone region. It's also very patriarchal in the way in which gender is sort of arranged in terms of marriage and in terms of gendered labor, etc. In terms of who's considered a worker, who is remunerated as a worker, for instance, and who is not. And in this context, I mean, the region is historically drought-prone, which is in Western India, not very far away from Mumbai, the city that I grew up in. And in this region, sugarcane is a cash crop that is grown extensively. And what is important to note that despite it being drought prone, sugarcane is a very water guzzling crop. So it also sort of extracts a lot of groundwater, which is one of the reasons why communities here have, experienced an increased intensity and frequency of drought, not just because of rainfall, but also because of groundwater extraction. Where, just to give you an example, earlier you could extract water, up to like, say, 100 feet, 200 feet. Today, they're digging wells as much as like 1,500 to 1,000 feet and not finding water, for instance. So it's a mix of reasons in terms of course, changing rainfall patterns, heat, etc., alongside industrialized agriculture. And in this context, there are several organizations, like grassroots groups, which are not very heavily funded, and that is actually going to be a call for, action in terms of what we can think of. Small groups, small organizations like the one that we worked with, called Swayam Shikshan Prayog. What they've been trying to do is really bring together women in the region to develop micro farming practices, but in a more optimum manner so that they can address questions around food security, questions around health, because a lot of women there are anemic, malnourished. Children are born malnourished, for instance, because of lack of nutrients and nutritious food. So it's quite interesting to sort of see how that model, which is on the one hand just an agricultural model in terms of sort of seeing what crops should be grown in what season, how they should be arranged. So it's called a 1 acre model, and thinking of it as a micro farming exercise. But what it in turn has done is actually increase like decision making powers of women in the household, for instance, because they're bringing some money. There's food on the plate, for instance. In addition to that, there is also some form of collective action. They're able to, they're also able to bring in some sort of surplus which is selling in the markets as well, in terms of bringing that linkage to the market and bringing money onto the table. So in a way, in terms of, I think this is one interesting integrated, consolidated, or a holistic way of looking at what climate action could look like, which links climate change, looks at gender relations, and is also coming up with a solution that has overall impacts in a more, consolidated, integrated manner. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's actually very hopeful. I have to ask you, was the program funded by, or you said it was very difficult to get funding or had very lightly funded. I guess the goal would be to have it be self-funded eventually, right? They would be independent. But I'm wondering if the funding has been jeopardized lately because of US policies. And that's not to say the US is the only personnel actor out there, but I just was curious real quick on that.
No, most certainly, Suzanne, because we're talking about, I mean, it can take us in different directions, but I think in this far right kind of world, and also in terms of where we're not, acknowledging climate change as a reality or gender as an existence, as something that even exists, for instance, a gender, different forms of gender and sexuality, that sense, it is really difficult to get funding in terms of, the funding landscape has changed. A lot of grassroots organizations are actually like falling apart. And that's where we can actually imagine, and we must imagine climate action to begin with, because like I began today's discussion around what climate change means is also very different for very different people. We're all in the same ocean, but clearly sailing in different boats. So I think that is one of the reasons why we need to think very locally, and that's been affected with the changing funding landscape, for sure.
Yeah, still hopeful that the local funding will come up, or more localized funding will come up. Sabrina, I wanted to turn to you because you're the one who sort of first touched on this idea of the food. I think you did, Rita, you may have mentioned it in your introductory remarks too, and sorry if I'm missing that. But the connection between our food and climate change. And I just didn't know if you had further comments on that, Sabrina.
Well, actually, I'm a bit worried because what I see around me, and when I say around me, I'm thinking Portugal and Europe in general, is that farmers in general do not seem to be adhering to the climate change narrative, or at least they are almost trying. They are denying it or delaying decisions that they should be taking. I'm thinking, for example, about schools, where young people are taught about farming, where they are supposed to become the next generation farmers. And most of the schools I'm aware of, they don't even have a climate change course integrated in the curriculum, which is absolutely shocking. How can a young person today learn about farming without having a strong component related to climate change? Not only because, well, it will obviously impact directly their work, but it is also a consequence of climate change. So it's on both ends of the spectrum. Current farming practices are currently contributing to worsening the issue, but on the other hand, they will also suffer probably firsthand some of the worst impacts of climate change. So maybe tying the knot between what we were just discussing about food security and with education, I think is absolutely crucial. And we shouldn't think only about children and young people. Adults need to be educated urgently. Adults who are working in the farming industry, but also adults who are, for example, officials, municipality officials, state officials. What I've been seeing is that a lot of people are simply unaware. Even people who are charged to work on these issues, and I'm thinking about one particular example I recently experienced. I had a meeting with two ladies from one municipality, and they were responsible for the municipal climate action plan. And when I met them, they immediately started, as we introduced ourselves, saying, "Oh, I don't understand anything about these things, but I was asked to do this, so here I am." And then I was thinking, okay, well, fair enough. Not everyone has to be an expert in climate change, actually. Well, even me, I'm doing a PhD in climate change, and I know almost nothing. This is an entire universe of knowledge. I could be an expert in energy. I could be an expert in farming practices. I could be an expert in environmental communication. So there are so many things that we cannot have answers for everything. But in that particular case, if you have people, officials who are responsible for climate change programs or climate change actions or governance, they should have the bare minimum of climate change education. And I think that because we are in today talking among ourselves with families is the great starting point to discuss climate change. When children go to school, if they have discussed this at home with parents, and it doesn't have to be very technical language, you don't have to use very technical things, but there are some basic things that can be discussed. The fact that they are aware, it means that they already have some openness to learn more, curiosity to learn more.
It gives them a framework from which to ask questions in school too, right? I mean, and it's the same for adults, frankly. Dylan has his hand raised.
Hi,
Thank
I
you.
was just gonna add something about like elected officials, because I know like one of the big things in the US is that there's a really big like oil and gas lobby in the US that spends a lot of money on elected politicians and helps like endorsements and stuff like that, which makes it, I think, a lot harder for a lot of politicians to want to do something for climate change because they're funded by oil and gas lobbies, which makes them more prone to doing pro drilling and other pro like gas policies that might negatively affect the environment.
Right. And that's really important insight, especially here in the United States, with we're so influenced by our politics are so influenced by industries, unfortunately. I want to put Sabrina, I'm going to put James up first because I did want to turn to him because about education and in the subject, and if you've come across or if that's something you've touched on in your work or go ahead.
Let me respond to Dylan real fast. Yeah, Dylan, you're totally right. I mean, as we all know, right, it's been denied as a real thing since the even the 70s and long ago, and we all know about the BP story and recycling probably and all that kind of misinformation. But misinformation is a massive issue in the climate inaction space. So I done some talks and presentations on the psychology of climate inaction. So what is it about our belief systems and structures that lead to kind of climate paralysis and even sort of misinformation structures being really stagnant and getting people really stuck. So it's a huge piece of the problem, and how industry and oil in particular. There's a great podcast called Drilled. You guys may have heard of that. It goes into all about the background in the oil industry and our current government, which is such a nightmare. But anyway, to a bit about education. So pivoting a little bit. So what's interesting, we talk about knowledge deficit, and we often, I think, get stuck or what's the word I'm looking for? I can't really think about it, but this idea that if we just educate people enough about climate change, that'll result in action. But actually, knowledge is a necessary but are really insufficient in predicting behavior change. And Sabrina, you probably know this from your work in behavioral sustainability work, but like for psychologically speaking, it just providing people education is really not a great predictor. But we spend a lot of time talking about we just need to educate, we just need to tell people. And so it's not a great predictor, unfortunately. There's lots of other things that are more predictive of behavior change when it comes to climate change. Happy to talk about that. But just I've done some cool work with a nonprofit in Boston where we've gone in where they go into schools and they start with middle school kids, so like third grade, and they're doing really fun climate science stuff. We've done some emotional resiliency work with little 5 and 6 and 7 year olds. So getting in early, so it's providing them some education about this issue, some emotional validation, but really giving them tools and strategies as to what they can do locally in their community with each other is actually super, super key for mitigation. So anyway, I'll pause there and hand it over.
And if you all, I was going to turn to Lynn, do you still have your hand up or you just leave it up? I just wasn't sure. Okay. And I'll turn to Sabrina in a second. I just wanted to make, if any of you experts or others have, as you're mentioning podcasts and things, I'm finding them and putting them in the chat. But if you have resources that you want to share, please do put them in the chat because I think it would be beneficial to everyone. Thanks. Sabrina, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, following what James just said, indeed, and we cannot assume that people who have the knowledge will act upon it for sure. But in terms of farming practices, in that case, it's more technical knowledge, not about climate change per se, but how do you deal with farming crops and knowing that this is happening and this will probably get worse over time. But about what Dylan was saying, I think that's an important point as well, is that when we discuss climate change, it often comes disconnected from social, economical, political, cultural issues. And I think that this has been the missing link over the past decades because climate scientists have been trying to explain, communicate what's going on. And I think that they haven't been really good at doing it. It's changing. I think there are now some people, even some climate scientists who became influencers, who are much better at getting to people and explaining in simple words with simple graphs what's going on. But there's been for quite a long time a tendency to isolate climate change as an issue when actually it is tied to everything we've been discussing today. We've been talking about so many different things. For example, farming, gender issues, racism. We won't be able to do anything about climate change, for example, if we don't tackle inequalities. That's a very basic thing. How can we build a more sustainable future if we have so many disparities between what some families have access to and some others? So at the end of the day, Dylan mentioned the lobby of fossil fuels, and indeed, unfortunately, there are quite a few scientific articles that have been published that demonstrate that many of these oil companies knew perfectly what was going on and many decades ago, and they were invested in trying to confuse people, in trying to what's the right word in English? But instead of being blunt about what was going on, they didn't have any interest in sharing that information widely. So this is still happening. They are using other strategies. They can no longer say that climate change doesn't exist, so they are using different strategies. One of them, for example, can be well, look, we are still exploring fossil fuels and gas, but at the same time, look, we are doing this massive investment in renewable energies. So they are trying to have a diverse portfolio so that people think that they are trying to do something. But if you compare the amount of money they are investing in the traditional, conventional fossil fuel activities compared to what they are saying that they are doing in renewable energies, for example, or carbon storage, capture and storage in investments, it's obviously ridiculous. And these industries, they are so powerful. We have allowed for these industries to accumulate so much wealth that it is very difficult for us now to protect our democracies. And I'm sure that James somehow touched on it. We have some examples around us of democracies that are weakening. And one of the reasons is precisely the fact that we have allowed for some groups of industries, fossil fuels is just one of them, but farming also has a very strong lobby. And they are not very interested as well in reducing emissions linked to methane and the big production of meat. So we people, we communities and families, we need to unite our efforts, because I personally believe that we can have an impact. And I could give you many examples here, but if you look in history, when people truly gather and mobilize and to tackle some issues, they can be very strong. And perhaps, you're not successful in the first attempt. You're not successful on the second attempt. But if you keep trying, at some point you're going to do some damage. You're going to be able to make some changes, and hopefully at some point, and you will able to drive real change.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's one of the chief reasons I became a vegan. It was partly for the animals and partly the realization that my removing my meat consumption may not make a change, but if a lot of people did it suddenly there was less meat consumption, it would make a change, not only environmentally directly with a direct effect, but also an economic impact on the industries, right? And I know not everyone has the luxury of choosing their food, so I say that with caution too. James, I think you may have comments on based on what Sabrina just said, but also we had a question in the chat for you to comment further on the, you probably saw it because you were posting a little more about the better predictors of changes in behavior.
Yeah. I think some of the better things to think about as sort of what we've all been talking about here today, but one of them is self-efficacy. That's a huge predictor of behavior change. So this idea of like, do you think you can make a difference, right? Or do you believe your actions can have a meaningful change? So what's so challenging is overcoming the pessimism and the doomerism and the kind of, which leads to sort of emotional paralysis, and that's actually a tool that misinformation drivers use. They really want to flood us with like negative stories, bad stories, and put the blame on you, right? That's the big piece. That's the whole recycling industry when it originated from years ago in BP was you're the cause of it. And so that leads us to feel like, oh my God, I'm one person in 9 billion and this. So I think that's why we need to really talk about stories of hope and change. So that sense of self-efficacy is really, really key. And then collective efficacy, right? Coming together as a group of individual social creatures. I think we work much better when we're doing something locally and in community. There's other pieces, social norming, right? So like seeing other people doing the studies, looking at, and Sabrina probably knows about this, like knowing that your neighbors are also installing solar or working on water consumption actually makes you more likely to do that as well. So there's sort of this contagion effect in a positive way. We're more likely to engage if we have an identity rooted in in nature and sort of our natural nature identity, that we care about it and it's meaningful to us. And then, of course, there's sort of direct experience, right? If you've had an experience with a climate event, you're more likely to then do something about that and act. So there's a couple of other pieces in there, but those are the kind of the big ones. It's really about sort of self-efficacy, a belief that you can make a difference. And then a great climate kind of one of my climate kind of heroes is Erin Elizabeth Johnson. You're probably familiar with her. She's a marine biologist, super awesome woman. She talks like, we're not going to do anything about this unless we get joy. We don't find our joy in climate change, and that seems like a weird thing to say, but if you don't enjoy what you're doing to try and change this, if it's all just depressing and sad, you're not going to have the staying power that's necessary to get this, big dial to shift. So finding what you love in change is actually really, really key to staying active, not getting burnt out, and continuing to find meaning in what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you for that. Zooming out to the sort of, Rita, I'm going to turn to you on the zooming out perspective. I wondered if you can comment about when we talked about education and awareness of adults. You don't need to comment specifically on education necessarily unless you're aware of any, but policymakers and their awareness. And I'm wondering how much you're seeing, because you work at the Global Climate Change Center, right? How much you're seeing an awareness from policymakers who are not necessarily in the climate change space, and so if you have any comments on that, meaning people incorporating this a little bit like we were talking about with Eloise in the One Health, people in disciplines you did not expect necessarily at first blush to be incorporating climate change concepts into the global policies.
Right. I think, yeah, that's such an important question, and it sort of stands at the heart and center of the work that we're doing. So just in terms of perspective, I think, in terms of just context, I think, what we're trying to do is, as part of the project that I'm involved in, we're looking at climate change and migration decisions, and, how people are migrating, and, why they're looking at migration as a form of adapting to climate change in South Asia. So working in India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan. And this is a project which is supported by the British government, the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office. So in terms of policymakers, for instance, there are at various levels that we're trying to see, and in terms of what kind of messages are going to each policymaker at every level is very, very crucial. So for instance, at a very local level, say for instance in Bhutan, wherein it's a conversation, it's also the form of government is very different compared to say India or compared to Nepal, or Bangladesh. So we are working very closely in terms of coming up with tangible interventions, sort of, learning from what communities are already doing and trying to see whether they can be replicated or, can be sort of can inspire similar sort of interventions in different pockets. So for instance, in Bangladesh, we've discussed the region quite a bit, the country quite a bit. There's a lot of work around planned relocation, because, for example, cyclones are such a big part of everyday reality in that sense, and, sort of brings in this extreme sort of shift in livelihoods almost overnight. But it's also a region, it's also a country, and especially provinces have planned relocation models which are quite well done, so where the government has intervened and there are policies in place where people are, sort of relocated, and there are these, so it's sort of thought through with local policymakers, and that local knowledge and know-how is something that I think can sort of inspire other regions as well. So we're trying to document that, work with policymakers, work with opinion makers as well, and discuss that. And recently, I think even the British government, because I'm based in the UK, I was recently in the House of Commons where we were talking to the Nature and Climate Change Department. It's like the all-party parliamentary committee with MPs, members of parliament, to try and discuss some of these issues and sort of see what you can learn from these global majority countries and, can be reproduced or thought through in the global north as well. So I think that kind of idea exchange and thinking of it in layers rather than having one unifying message is something that I think is very important when you're engaging with policymakers.
Thank you. That's helpful. It's also hopeful to know that it is happening, even if it may not be happening on a scale we need yet, but it's hopeful to know. Eloise has her hand up, and then I'm going to ask each of you, each of the experts, if nobody else has their hand up, to just give us a another short message of hope if you have one at the end. And again, not to be Pollyanna-ish, but we do have some young people on, and I do want them to feel like there's action items they can take. Thanks. Go ahead, Eloise.
Yeah, I really like what you just said, because there's a huge partnership actually between the Netherlands and Bangladesh, because although they're far apart in the world, they experience the same issues. There's a big knowledge translation exchange there. Um, and another, because you were talking about cooperation and some collaboration with different sectors, and another one that I didn't expect, but I don't know why I didn't expect it. It's with the building industry, so engineers and architects, and research centers are really booming, and the collaboration with research in Bangladesh for those sectors, because they're thinking, why are we building with bricks? And a big thought came from, well, that's colonial heritage. And they moved away from bamboo to that, when actually bamboo is a super strong, oh, okay, I don't have a background in this, please. But from what I've learned, it's super strong structure, very climate friendly. And so can we maybe rethink the way that we build, moving away from what we've always done and thinking a bit more originally, and also the way that we design houses, do they have to be with a flat roof? Maybe if you have a circular roof like this, then when the big winds blow, then they go, instead of completely pushing against the base of the structure so that it would fall down. And then it starts a big reflective process of like, okay, but let's be creative in the way that we want to rebuild. So what are new materials out there? What can we exploit? So then there's some chemical engineers that come into play, but also design. Like, it's not just with what we build, but how we build. And I actually had a really great talk with a Ugandan colleague recently, where they were discussing some UNESCO's heritage of the way that we build houses sometimes in some parts of sub-Saharan Africa with mud. And those are super climate friendly, and they still have it. So these traditional ways of doing, can we go back to them and maybe reuse them, because we've neglected them nowadays? But also innovation, and innovation is almost like a buzzword nowadays, but what do we mean by it? Then maybe it's also creativity. So yeah, I would say those have been really great collaborations. And I guess maybe it's my message of hope while I'm at it, while you just asked the question. It's that um, sometimes I would speak with people and they'd be like, yeah, but we just made 5 houses. What is 5 houses in the big scheme of things? But actually, okay, we visited on the field these 5 people who have had new houses that are built differently, and they have resisted the cyclone that recently happened. And then they made floating toilets. So the toilets were not spilling everywhere and were not completely destroyed. So that increased the hygiene around. So yeah, your toilet will move around during the disaster, but it's floating, and that's good for hygiene. So it's not now creating any visible impact, but when you go and you meet the people, they're so happy and they're so much healthier. So instead of thinking about numbers and impacts, let's stay with the qualitative feelings of people saying, I'm very happy with this, and it's improving.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it. Asni, we just have a few more minutes, and I want to let some of the speakers at least but please go ahead because you haven't spoken yet. Thank you, Eloise.
Yeah, it's so interesting hearing from all the experts who like spend so many years researching and working with people, finding solutions. But yeah, I just wanted to share like a personal experience. So I'm in DC right now, but I'm actually from Phoenix, Arizona, which is like one of the hottest, if not the hottest city in the US. And I remember thinking I would never move here because it's 110 degrees like chronically in summer. And so like going outside is kind of like a health risk. There's also a lot of pollution, and there's a lot of there's a high population with respiratory illnesses in the city. Um, and so that was just a problem that I think always comes up to my head, like global warming. Yeah, that's all I wanted to share.
I think, Suzanne, you're muted and maybe your Wi-Fi connection's not great. I think she's frozen, right? Or is it me?
Yeah, I
Maybe
think
I'm
she's frozen.
frozen.
Yeah, for me as
Okay.
well. Yeah.
Well, while we're waiting for Susan to join us again, thank you for sharing, Esme. I think it's important that we recognize the signals of climate change where we live. Sometimes they are more visible, and then in some places they're more visible than others. But at the end of the day, they everywhere. You will, if you engage with nature and you talk with people who have been around for longer, they will tell you how it used to be before. It happens to me a lot when I go to a new place I've never been before. I really enjoy talking with older people because they really describe you how this used to be, and you will understand that the changes that have been going on in each community.
Yeah, people talk about that as the shifting baseline phenomenon, where,
Yeah.
your baseline, Esme, is different than your parents and their parents. And sometimes that leads us to be complacent because we think this is the normal. So that sort of arc of experience over time is talking to older folks and elders, particularly Indigenous folks, is really key in kind of understanding how to, recenter that shifting baseline experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was also thinking about Arizona as a state where apart from global warming, there are no tornadoes, there are no natural disasters outside of like droughts that hit states. So there's a lot of data centers, Amazon, Intel that are, being constructed there. I think they're discussing possible cloud seeding to help with the drought.
Perhaps
Very
I can.
sorry about that. I think my computer was overheating and so I had to, it froze. Sorry, go ahead, Sabrina.
Yeah, sorry. I was just maybe just commenting on what Esme just said, because that's a point that came up quite frequently and during our chat talking about data centers. So I worked for Google Cloud in the past. And that's also why I dramatically changed my life. And I decided 4 years ago, I just dropped this corporate life in the cloud industry and decided to do this PhD in climate change because this had been in my heart from the beginning. When I was 20-ish, I studied sustainability and energy, renewable energies and everything. But then my life took a different turn and I ended up working with for IT, big American IT companies. And I ended up at some point in Google Cloud. And I remember that I was not feeling aligned with my own values when you're thrown, you're really getting a narrative and you feel that people live in a very enthusiastic, innovative bubble, where everything is great. Artificial intelligence is going to solve some of the world's most important issues. And then you start, thinking to yourself, actually, is that as they say? And then, this just didn't make sense to me, and that's why I took this decision. But I think that most people who work in these industries, it's not that they are not aware of what's going on, but it's almost like they are decoupling. They are able to decouple what they are doing because they have to make money, because they have to pay for their own things, and what's going on in the world, and not necessarily feeling that they are also part of the industry that is also contributing to the problem. But it is, data centers are a big issue. AI could use roughly 8% of the world electricity consumption in the next couple of years. So it's something we absolutely need to consider. And it is an issue, not only AI, but everything else, crypto money, blockchain, the amount of data that we are accumulating. I mean, I'm sure all of you are accumulating a lot of data with photographs, filming, etc. But that's just a tiny drop in the ocean. Companies are managing more and more data, and this data is sitting somewhere in servers, and then they need redundancy because they need this backing up data. So it's a whole world that is also part of the issue, but perhaps we can discuss that in a different
dialogue. Yeah, the data centers on its own could be a subject, right? I think we could touch on it. And they're building them for, speaking of redundancy, they're building them partly to be resistant to climate change issues, right? Ironically. I'm sensitive to time. We're just on time now. I did want to leave with something for each of you to comment on that leaves action items for the audience to. It's not an audience because it's not speakers, participants to engage in. Ritika, I'll start with you. James, I'll end with you because I think since you deal with the psychological, I kind of wanted you to wrap it up that way. Ritika, please.
Yeah, I think this has been such a rich dialogue. And for me, I think if I have to think of takeaways, I think it's important. One is to not look at climate change as, look at it as a justice issue. I think that's something which we've discussed quite a bit. Is probably to engage further and try and understand, and I think one major issue is how some of these narratives are very causal, very simplistic in terms of climate change is this and climate change leads to that. But really educating ourselves in terms of what are the nuances, what is the intersectionality. And I think reading more and engaging more with that is something which I think is important. And just the other thing is that we all have access to our communities, groups, families. We're all on social media, etc. Using these platforms and our privileges to, bring these conversations to the fore, I think is so important. The more we need all the more and more of it. I think that's something which I'll leave this dialogue with. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Sabrina, a few words on that?
Sure.
On something to leave our participants with.
Sure. Well, I would say one simple sentence, lead by example. And your example may be something as simple as, I'm going to do something in my own house. I'm going to fit my roof with a solar panel. Or if you lead by example, you will inspire other people around you. And it doesn't have to be something, expansive or completely revolutionary. These are very tiny things that you can do to inspire other people, and that's what we need. And I think that public pressure it can be really, really strong. And I doubt that the likes of the BPs and the Shells of Exxons of this world would be inclined to sue to file a lawsuit against Greenpeace, for example, if they didn't feel that it was actually doing some harm. So actually, we can together manage to move the needle.
Thank you for that. James left some good books, by the way, for everyone, if you haven't looked in the chat. It's a cut and paste. So speaking to Ritika's point about educating yourselves, gaining awareness about all the different layers of this, I suspect those books speak to that. And James, I'll turn it over to you for some last words. And then we do want to get everybody on screen. Paul will really kill me if I don't take a picture of everybody on screen before leaving. So if everybody who's off could come on, and while James is speaking, I'll ask Osmi to take a screenshot.
Yeah, check out Ian Elizabeth Johnson as well. I can put that in All We Can Save, and she's got What If We Get It Right, which is another great hopeful book, and Rebecca's work on It's Not Too Late. Lots of inspiration there. For me, I think it's just things like this, right? You're all experts. You have experts in your lived experiences, getting hope, meeting people, talking to people, collective action, super critical, thinking locally, not to get paralyzed by the giant sort of nebulous, huge thing that is climate change, is to think global, act local is sort of how I want to. And what are we clinging to? Like, why would we want to keep the fossil fuel industry around? It's like, I'm not anxious about losing that at all. I think change leads to creativity. So I'm excited for sort of the potential that we can have as humanity to really take this moment and get things to change. Because like, well, why would we want to keep this around? It's like it's terrible, so we have to get rid of it, and we can do it.
Thank you. Ritika, Sabrina, James, Eloise, Yukta, I apologize, Yukta, and Azmi. Thank you all for your Azmi working in the background too for me. So thank you. Azmi, did you get a screenshot of everyone? Were you able to do that?
I have like 20 pages of screenshots.
Okay, perfect. You're doing it in the background. Great. Thanks so much. Appreciate everyone's participation and time on this. Sorry we went over a little bit. It was, as usual, really fascinating and a different experience for me to be moderating. So thank you all. Great to see you and appreciate your
Wait,
words.
no, please don't leave,
Thank
guys.
you.
We need one more
Wait.
picture.
Oh,
Okay.
For smiles. Okay.
Okay.
Yes, yes. Okay, I'm gonna count 3, 2, 1, and then ready. So 3, 2, 1. Awesome. All right, thank you guys.
Bye,
thank you.
everyone.
Thank
Thanks
you,
again,
everyone.
everyone. Thanks so
Have a
much.
good one.
Bye.
Bye.
Care.